Welcome to the exchange on Zeteo. As the genocide in Gaza continues and the student demonstrations on Ivy League campuses here in the United States escalate, Yale University has found itself in the eye of the storm. Yale has seen a week-long student hunger strike, student protests calling for divestment from Israel, and dozens of arrests. Earlier this week, Bret Stephens in the New York Times attacked Yale for allowing what he called anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish protests. Joining me to discuss what's really happening on the ground in Yale is my friend, the Yale University professor of philosophy, Ilse Stanley, who is Jewish himself and the author of the upcoming book on fascism, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Jason, welcome, and please let us know what's happening really on Yale and how much misinformation and hysteria is out there versus what you are seeing on the ground.
So there's a tremendous amount of misinformation, and we've encountered this numerous times in the American past when there are anti-war protests on university campuses. And that's what we have. We have anti-war protests on university campuses. They're not violent anti-war protests. I visited the Yale encampment on Beinecke Plaza before it was taken down, and there was no violence. There were people singing. There were a small group of counter protesters, maybe 5 or 6. I didn't exactly, somewhere between 5 and 10. There were a lot of students protesting. There weren't barriers between the small groups of counter protesters and the protesters. I had students in both groups. I had many students protesting. I knew one of the counter protesters, or she knew me. We had friendly dialogue. I think there were many Jewish students protesting. So there was a very large tent, Jews for Ceasefire Now. There was a Seder that the Jewish students held or directed. So it was an anti-war protest against a war that is being funded by U.S. arms, and students, as they always have, are protesting U.S. support for what looks to be an ongoing genocide in Gaza,
Jason, what do you think of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who released a video yesterday comparing U.S. students who are protesting, as you said, a war with Nazi Germany in the 30s, and Bret Stephens in the New York Times calling these protests anti-Jewish protests, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish?
Right. Those are two very different claims. I mean, both false, but one is a level of, of absurdity. The Netanyahu's claim. I mean, Netanyahu's claim to make analogies between protests, anti-war protests, and National Socialism, which was all about total war, is beyond absurd. And bears little comment. Bret Stephens's piece and claims. That takes a little bit more unpacking. Note that in Bret Stephens's op-ed, the title was parenthesis, what it's like to be a visible Jew on Ivy League campuses today. Now, what does that mean? What's going on there with that visible Jew? Now, you have to deal with the fact that one of the largest identity groups protesting out there on college campuses are Jewish Americans. Who are shocked and horrified by Israel's actions in Gaza. Which is not to say that anyone supports Hamas. That is obviously not happening. But there are Jewish groups, there are many Jewish students who are shocked and horrified by Israel's actions. And then there are many Jewish students who are just sort of in between various views and don't know exactly what to think. And then there's a small group of Jewish students who, as they have every right to do, are counter-protesting or strongly in support of Israel's actions in Gaza. Now, when Bret Stephens talks about visible Jews, What he's really saying is that the only real Jews are Orthodox Jews, and that Jewish people like me, who my son was bar mitzvah this week. I mean, Jewish people like me are not real Jews because we're not visible Jews. And the idea is that visible Jews are somehow being targeted. Now, this is really upsetting because it splits American Jews apart from each other. It sends a message to groups of American Jews who are not Orthodox that we're not really Jewish, because you can't really say that we're being attacked on campus. And you can't even really say that visible Jews are being attacked on campus. There are no such attacks. But this divisiveness of sort of breaking apart the American Jewish community is I think, reprehensible. And they're obviously not anti-Semitic protests. If you care about Israel, then you don't want Israel committing genocide, because that's a stain on the country that will last for generations to come. So it's absolutely no wonder that Jewish students are involved in this.
So Jason, there were on video some very alarming chants, such as "Go back to Poland" or "Burn down Tel Aviv." Those kind of statements and those kind of chants that were recorded on video are not connected directly. But in the media, the narrative is this is the kind of protest that is basically dominating college campuses. Can you please elaborate on that? Have you ever heard any of these comments?
I have never heard such comments. And if I did, I would be very upset, and I hope that people would have been there I don't want to return to Poland, and I don't want Tel Aviv to be burned. I mean, I would be extremely upset if I heard such chants. If I heard anyone giving such chants, I would approach them and speak to them about it. And if they were, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine any Yale student doing that, but kids are kids, and people can. But I mean, that would be horrifying to me. I certainly didn't hear any such chants. My office is right, overlooks cross campus where the current protests are taking place. And, I certainly didn't hear such chants. And I have multiple students who are involved in those protests and know how strongly I feel about being Jewish. So
you're saying that these anti-war protests are not a threat to Jewish students, even though you're describing accurately that many of these students are themselves Jews. Have you ever felt threatened? Do you think any of your Jewish students felt threatened?
I mean, when I say, do I think that any of my Jewish students feel threatened, I think the whole atmosphere is tense. So when you have campus protests, it results in everybody being tense, and people whose views differ slightly from each other, vehemently disagreeing and cutting each other off on social media. And we experienced this in the 2016 campus protests. Next, Yale, of the Black Lives Matter movement as it moved onto campus. The same thing happened. A lot of students are not happy. A lot of students discover that they have slightly different views. One student might be for a two-state solution. Another student might be for a one-state solution. They might not speak to each other for a certain time. There's a lot of tension on campus between a lot of different people. And so that is just always necessarily the case in moments like in times of political struggle. So my students are feeling stressed out. They're feeling they're probably there's some feeling sometimes, I think, in all of these spaces where you feel people are getting a little bit too much glee, and that we Jewish people can be oppressors. And so there's definitely, I definitely feel like others on campus that there's tensions, but the idea that this is different from other anti-war protests. I mean, I think it's an anti-war protest, and
Yes.
protests are tense moments.
So why do you think university presidents feel that it's necessary to enlist the police and National Guard to arrest students and to deal with what is what's clearly is a peaceful protest. And why do you think they feel the pressure, and where this come from?
Well, what we're facing is the authoritarian playbook, as Ruth Ben-Ghiat calls it. We're facing a situation where the right wing, the far right, the authoritarian movements are attacking the universities. And we know this from India, we know this from Hungary, we know this from Turkey, we know this from all the countries where there's an authoritarian ethno-nationalist, or even not ethno-nationalist, like China, movement. They target the universities because they know the students are sources of protest to authoritarianism. Now, the claim of anti-Semitism is just today's excuse. In 2016, it was wokeism or whatever. It was anti-racism. Now it's anti-Semitism. In a couple of years, it'll be something else. But so what we're seeing as we move into this political, further and further into this political moment, into tilting into authoritarianism, is we're seeing these emboldened attacks on universities. And what we're seeing from university administration is what Timothy Snyder calls anticipatory obedience. The belief that if you roll over and do what they want, do what the authoritarians want you to do, that they'll leave you alone. So that's what we're seeing is an anticipatory obedience. As we've seen in other countries, some of this runs through the donors who will put pressure on the administrators. But we're just going to see more and more of this, and there's going to be pressure to hire people who share the authoritarian view, or there's going to be denunciations of universities for being anti-patriotic, as we see in India, for example. So we're seeing anticipatory obedience.
Jason, we're not in India. We're in the United States, where there is a democratic administration. Yale University is a liberal institution. Columbia is a liberal institution. So you're talking about authoritarianism in the context of a Biden administration, which is democratic, and one on the platform of defending democracy and liberal educational institution. How do you explain that?
Rula, good on pressing me. Well, I think there's some desire. I think donors have, in these institutions, long been resistant to the idea of student protesters. I mean, that's an old story in American academic life, but in the private institutions, this happened in 2016 as well. There was something very upsetting about students protesting against faculty and administration and the universities and disobeying rules. And so that's why I'm mentioning authoritarianism in this context, because there is this impulse to respond to young people protesting with outrage, even though universities have always been sites of protest. So I think, I think that's in large part, it does remind me of 2016. It does remind me of that moment before Trump came in, when you had the same thing. Oh, on campus protesting, we've got to do something about it. So obviously there are strong feelings with respect to the particular situation with what I believe is an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and I think there's a lot of different camps here. There's people who are sort of strictly anti-Zionist, and then there are people who think the state, who are Zionist in some form or another, but disapprove strongly with the actions we're seeing. And anti-war protests, as we know from the 1960s, they can get pretty rough. And not rough into, they can get politically charged, because you're dealing with people's lives, a large number of people's lives, and students. So those, it's not like people always think. There's this bizarre thing where people think the campus is not the real world. The campus is not part of the world. The campus is, in fact, part of the world. And when you have violence happening outside in the world and disorder, you're going to have, well, disorder. Well, when you have unrest and moral complexity happening outside in the world, well, the campus is going to reflect that. Now, of course, the campus, we have to keep the campus protests from being violent, but they have been nonviolent. But I think that some of the external intensity of the world situation is also affecting what's happening, the responses to the nonviolent protests on campus.
So, Jason, who do you think benefits most from conflating this anti-war activism with anti-Semitism? Because we could see the debate shifting towards saying what happened in Charlottesville in 2017 with the Nazi chanting, blood and soil, Jews will not replace us, with those students actually saying, end complicity with Israel and complicity with the genocide on Gaza. Who do you think benefit the most from this? And why do you think the media is obsessed? They are covering this war, wall-to-wall coverage, while actually ignoring the stories about mass graves in Gaza and the stories about mass starvation.
Great point, Rula. It's hard to see that it's not intentional. To me, what we have is an ongoing genocide, stories of mass graves in Gaza, and suddenly, instead of the world's empathy being directed towards innocent Palestinian civilians, I'm not talking about Hamas, but innocent Palestinian civilians and children, suddenly we have this shifting to Jewish students on campus, and it's too. It looks intentional. It looks almost planned, because we should be paying attention to the war crimes happening in Gaza right now, and not disputes between different groups of students on Ivy League campuses. So obviously, when you look at the major newspapers, the op-ed pages of major newspapers, and it's all about Jewish students on campus being victimized. It takes the world's attention, or the Americans' attention, away from what we really need to be focused on, which is our military support for an ongoing genocide in Gaza.
Jason, you described your Jewish background as informing your writing on fascism. And you're right, I want to quote you directly. To me, my Judaism means an obligation to pay attention to equality and to the rights of minority groups. Can you please elaborate on how your Jewishness or Jewish background forged and formed your activism?
Well, being as I am from parents who came from Europe, during the Nazi period, I grew up with these warnings about what it means to be a minority group, what it means to be a group that is targeted by a majority. And in the United States, there has been anti-Semitism, but we haven't been the national majority in the national minority in the United States. It's really African Americans who've largely been the national minority, indigenous people. And so we're out of that targeting that we faced in Europe, in many countries in Europe. But I was brought up by parents who recorded that targeting in their DNA, as it were. My mother was a court stenographer in Manhattan Criminal Court for many years. My father was a sociologist, both in different ways. One theoretically, one just from what she was seeing, saw how societies somehow always used scapegoats in their politics. And since we were scapegoats, the lesson was always, number one, be careful, protect other groups that are being scapegoated. And number two, recognize the signs of scapegoating. So to me, I think of being Jewish as an identity that brings with it this heritage that you're supposed to pay attention to these mechanisms of scapegoating. And also, my family, my father's family was German Jewish and part of the German liberal tradition that was part of that was devoted to the view that Jews could be equal citizens of countries with non-Jewish populations. And so this devotion to the idea of secular equal citizenship is central to my identity, because Jewish people didn't have equal citizenship in Europe for so long and won it through the Enlightenment and liberalism. So this idea of a state that is based on secular citizenship, so everyone can have their own religion, everyone can have their own identity. To me, that's central to the European Jewish tradition. So this idea that you should have states that are based on religions or national identity, that really runs counter to my form of Judaism, which is that there should be equality for all under the law, and citizens of different religions, different ethnic backgrounds should all be equal, because that's what gave European Jews the rights they held for so long.
So when Naomi Klein, the intellectual, writes that she opposed a militarist ethno-state, and which see in the discourse of many students who are protesting, not only protesting the militarism and the ethno-state, and many of them are Jews, they're actually protesting predominantly America's blind support, billions of dollars, on the day that the UN called for investigation of the mass graves, and also the lies about UNRWA. On that day, this is when they approved additional $26 billion. Do you think this is what enrages the students?
The students, I don't want to speak for our students. I've learned a lot from them. I also think there are a lot of diverse views represented among the protesting students, from people who are opposed to Zionism in any form to people who feel a deep bond with the state of Israel and do not want to see their a country they feel a deep bond with implicated in a world historical crime. So I think there's that diversity of views that I want to respect among the protesting students. But I think, speaking for myself, I am an American. I'm not Israeli. I'm an American, and I don't want my country to be implicated in to be much less actively supporting collective punishment, which is a war crime. So I think there no doubt are many students who share my view that that collective punishment is a war crime. The United States has committed war crimes, like in the Iraq War, which was also a response to a terrorist attack, and massacring large numbers of civilians is not a really good response to a terrorist attack. And so just as I feel responsibility as an American for the Iraq War, I think I and many students feel that their country shouldn't be responsible, shouldn't be implicated in this kind of response to a terrorist attack.
So 20 years ago, during the on the eve of the Iraq War, millions of people around the world protested, millions, including in the United States, 2 million, I believe. And many of us were called basically terrorist sympathizers or pro-Saddam regime, etc. It seems like history is repeating itself, but now it's inserting itself with basically right-wing activists and a political wing that is trying to literally criminalize student protesting. And now they're claiming they've been subjected to violent acts. I want to reference the claim of right-wing students, right-wing activists, who said that was stabbed in the eye by a Palestinian flag, which then we learned that it's basically exaggerated. And we've seen also philosophy professors elsewhere that are being arrested. Jason, where all of this heading? I mean, we can see all these signals that you talked about, study the signs, the signals, start to understand what's happening. Where do you think this can be heading without a severe intervention? What I mean by that, by the administrators and this administration actually rethinking how to engage with students.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this, because I think this is something, I mean, obviously we have war crimes to worry about, and an anti-war movement that is speaking for many people. Of course, these protest movements started universities, as they did during the Vietnam War as well. This is not new. When Reagan ran for office as governor of California, he ran in part against the anti-war movement. So if you're an authoritarian government, if you want to establish an authoritarian regime, we see this in Turkey. We see this, you want to make sure that the students are going to be afraid, the universities are going to be afraid that you're going to crack down, bring the National Guard in, things like this. That, we're familiar with how this ends up with Kent State in the United States when they brought the National Guard in and 3 students were killed. So I think what happens in these moments is that the authoritarian movement looks for different ends. So here they're going to ally with people who want to support Israel in this time, want to support Israel's invasion at this time, because actually I think many people want to support Israel. Many protesting students want to support Israel. They want to support Israel by saying, "Don't commit a genocide." But what's happening is a kind of cynical weaponization of anti-Semitism to crack down on university protests in advance of essentially a somewhat autocratic or authoritarian takeover, like we see in many countries. So I would wish the administrators would have the foresight to see this and would have the foresight to resist this kind of pressure from outside political forces and make their own decisions. On the other hand, history does not suggest that that this kind of courage is frequent enough.
Jason, I start this conversation asking you if, as a Jewish professor, but also if you think these anti-war protests are a threat to Jewish students, and you said no. And I want to end this conversation by asking you: do you think the crackdown, the presence of the police and the National Guard and others are a threat and can lead to violence against anti-protest students?
Yeah, we are right now suffused with rhetoric that justifies political violence along many dimensions, and this is just one. When you start calling professors and students terrorists or supporters of terrorism, you are setting them up for violence. When you start saying that Democrats and political opponents are opening up the borders with the aim of replacing the population of the United States, you are setting them up for violence. We are seeing all over the American politics rhetoric that justifies violence against political opponents, that protesting students. So all of this is very dangerous, and we're seeing it in numerous areas of life directed against any group that might provide a kind of resistance or protest against essentially the far right. So
you know what's incredible? This morning I was watching international TVs, and in Iran and in Pakistan, they're not reporting about the war in Gaza. They're reporting about what's happening on college campuses in the United States. And the most significant question that a lot of them are asking: why would the leaders of this country, Democrats in this case, are willing to damage America's reputation, standing in the world, rule-based international order, and to appease Netanyahu's ethno-state and need for revenge? Do you have an answer for
that? I wish I did. I mean, the Netanyahu. I mean, I think Netanyahu. My own view of him is that he is part of this fascist internationale of Orban, Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, and we have and what is happening is in fact not good for the future of the state of Israel, and it's originally should be some kind of secular liberal democracy, but it is strayed extremely far from that, to say the least. And the United States should use its influence to arrest that and reverse it, to somehow get a rein on things. I mean, giving people an open an open purse with no conditions. It's like nothing I mean, it seems wild diplomatically. But I don't know. I'm not really sure what the right. I'm not in enough of a foreign policy expert on the Middle East to say how you negotiate between all of these different conflicting interests in the Middle East. My interest, my concern is to stop the genocide in Gaza and to gradually reverse the slide of Israel into a kind of ethno-nationalist quasi-fascist state that it might veer into. We're seeing authoritarian crackdowns everywhere in Israel. So this is what I'm concerned with. I would want my own country of the United States to have some kind of agency and efficacy in influencing Israeli policy, and not just give the Israeli government, especially this Israeli government, a blank check.
Thank you, Jason. I want to remind everybody that Netanyahu is the one that actually normalized Donald Trump, even after he said that these are fine people in Charlottesville, and legitimized Victor Orban, who is a real anti-Semite. So I thank you very much, Jason, and see you next time.
Thank you, Rula.